To make a mock-up or not to make a mock-up? That is the question for today. Hello and welcome to Tears of Joy Creative and my new series called Out of the Jar, as all of my projects that are in my closet are listed here in the jar, and I'm letting the jar choose which one is next. That is after I pick one, of course. For more information on that, I will leave a link below in the description box to my intro video where I give a rundown of all of my projects. And the first one I chose is number 3. Vogue number 1348. Out of this beautiful batik. So my question to you is, when you're making garments for yourself, do you make a mock-up? I have learned the hard way that making a mock-up is very important because some of these fabrics are close to 10 years old, and I'm sure there's no way that I could replace them. And it's one of the main reasons why we should always be making a mock-up when testing out patterns. Mock-ups can show you where the fit issues are, as well as help you perfect certain modifications if you're looking to change things up. So before I make my mock-up, let's talk about this pattern for a minute. My measurements put me in a 12 in the bust, a 14 in the waist, and somewhere between a 16 and an 18 in the hips. Now sometimes your patterns will give you finished garment measurements. Well, this one only gives you the bust. I'm not too worried about how it's going to fit in the hips because it's very pleated. My concern is across the tummy and the bust area. Now this dress is 15 pattern pieces, but to make a mock-up, I only need the front and the back to see how this is going to fit. The rest of it is lining, underlining, and it even has you make a petticoat. But what do you do if you don't have any extra fabric lying around for a mock-up? Go to your local thrift store and get one of these. This cost me $4. And that was the thickest sheet I could find at my local thrift store, as it is similar to the batik fabric I'm using for my dress. One of the biggest pieces of advice I can give you when it comes to working with patterns is to make a mock-up. I've learned this the hard way, and I have not made this pattern before. So I'm using this thrifted sheet as a test to see how this dress fits. I think this looks pretty good. Overall, I like the way this dress fits. It's just a bit too big in the top, so I'm going to adjust that by taking in the upper sides, but careful not to get too tight across my tummy. I'm also going to take in the underbust curve to give me more shape. That's much better. Now I can make these adjustments to the pattern, and tomorrow it will be time to cut all the pieces from the actual fabric. So before I can cut out all of my pieces, I need to transfer the adjustments back onto the pattern. So I have trimmed down the seam allowance on the mock-up to 5/8 of an inch and then took it all apart. Now I can lay the pattern back on top of the fabric and trace where I took it in at the upper sides and underbust area, and then just trim that off of the pattern. Now I can transfer those adjustments onto the lining and underlining pieces. I went round and round about which way to cut the stripes for this dress. I didn't think I had enough fabric to cut the stripes vertical until I measured it. Then I used my iPad to create a version of both to see the difference, and in the end, I decided to cut the stripes vertical. Now there are many methods to add markings to your fabric, and normally I would use chalk, but instead I'm using a colored wax pencil since there are a lot of markings to this pattern and chalk tends to rub off. I'm also cutting the facings and the pockets from the dress fabric. I'm using a lightweight broadcloth cotton for the underlining. And lastly, the lining. This will also be what I use to make the petticoat with. Phew! All 15 pieces are finally cut. Time to work on the underlining. The underlining is basically a layer of lightweight fabric that supports the top layer and adding body and stability to your garment. This gets stitched on with a long basting stitch within the seam allowance. Time for the assembly. And here's a few sewing tips that may help you when it comes to garment construction. When sewing princess bust seams together, you need to sew a row of stay stitching between the 2 notches on the center front. That's the straight side. This will allow you to clip the seam allowance to accommodate for the curve of the bust on the side front. If you ever have one side of the seam allowance that is a bit bigger than the other, you can ease it in while sewing by putting the fuller side down and letting the feed dogs ease it through the machine. When it comes to pressing, you need to get a ham. Whether it's a sleeve roll or a big fat ham, get one as they are a must for pressing curved seams. One good reason for the underlining is that it allows you to tack the pleats in place so they don't flop around. When doing any kind of hand sewing like this, or sewing on a button, use a 4-thread strand in your needle, as it is much faster and more secure than 2. On to the invisible zipper, and I'm going to show you an easy way I was taught to sew one in. You just need to make sure that your zipper extends 2 inches past the opening of whatever seam you're sewing it into. Just don't forget to press the teeth flat before sewing it in. Now sew down the right side using your regular presser foot because it will keep the teeth flat and you can stitch right in the ditch next to the teeth. And you want to sew past the opening an inch or so. Zip up the zipper a few inches and turn your garment over. Turn under the seam allowance and pinch it together with your thumb and index finger. Then flip it back over and pin the zipper tape to the seam allowance like this. Then unzip the zipper and insert the pull tab through the hole and pull it through. Now you see why it needs to be slightly longer than your opening because you will then be able to sew down the left side of the zipper. When you're done, you just grab the pull tab and pull it through the opening, and when you flip it over, you should have a nice flat seam, no puckers. This dress is fully lined and has a facing which needs some sew-in or iron-on interfacing, whichever you prefer. Just be sure to transfer your markings onto the interfacing so your pieces line up. The facing also gets a row of stay stitching, which, if you didn't know, acts as a barrier against the fabric stretching when sewing around curves, as you do for the curve of the bust seam. It also helps the fabric from tearing when you clip the seam allowance so you can sew it to another curve, as well as helps to ease in the fullness of the curve you are sewing it to. In most of my sewing projects, you will find me using my serger, as it has basically become my right hand, outside of using my regular sewing machine. I am very spoiled with it, and I have had this one for probably 15 years now. And since I am making a petticoat out of a lining fabric, I am serging off all the cut edges because this material frays a lot. I'm also using it to sew a rolled hem, which is a super fast way to hem a lining. Is it absolutely necessary to own a serger? No. You can use a pair of pinking shears to cut lining fabric, which will help to keep it from fraying. And you can also use a zigzag stitch on your regular machine on your seam allowance as well. When it comes to sewing gathering stitches on a long piece like a ruffle, I find it helpful to break my stitches at each quadrant, but you don't have to. Same as when I pin the ruffle layer on, I pin it at each quadrant before pulling the gathering stitches tight. Now I am well aware, since I am using a lining fabric for this petticoat, that it's not going to give the dress much fullness, and I debated whether or not to add some gathered tulle on top of the ruffled layer, which is an easy thing to do. For now, I'm going to make it the way the pattern has you make it, but you can add gathered tulle or make the ruffle layer out of a stiffer fabric. Now when it comes to following directions that are written on the pattern instructions, most people will try to follow them to a T. In this case, it wants me to sew the lining to the dress around the top edge and then hand sew the lining to the zipper. Well, I'm not doing that because it is much faster to attach the lining to the zipper first with a zipper foot, then you fold over the zipper and stitch across the upper back, around the armhole, and the front neck edge. I would have to say that this pattern's level of difficulty is advanced. It does not say that on the envelope, but there are things that you already need to know when constructing this dress. For instance, it doesn't give you any pressing instructions, like when to press your seams open. You will just notice that in the diagram pictures. Also, they do not tell you to trim your seam allowance and clip your curves before sewing the understitching around the top edge. And this is something that you must do in order for things to lay flat. Once I turn the dress right side out and give it a good press, I can sew the shoulders together by sewing the outside layer first and then hand sewing the lining closed. For the final touches, I'm adding a hook and eye to the top of the zipper and turning under a 1/2 inch for the hem. And that's it! My dress is finished. And sadly, this is the only pair of shoes I have to wear with them right now. But I do believe it is time for the big reveal. Time for some final thoughts on this dress. First of all, I love it. I love the color, the fabric, and the style. It is definitely me. So would I make this Vogue number 1348 again? I actually would. But this time, I would do something different about this wimpy crinoline on the bottom. It definitely needs something else. More ruffles, some gathered tulle, something to actually give it some body. But I will tell you that this fabric in this dress, it is warm. I mean, it is really warm outside right now. If I wear it, I'm going to have to be somewhere where there's a lot of air conditioning, maybe out to dinner, or wear it in the fall. But I would definitely make it again. It wasn't that complicated. There were things that you needed to know, like it's not a beginner pattern, and you have to have a basic sewing knowledge of putting garments together. I am super excited about this series. It really did help me to stay focused on one project and not a whole bunch. And I can't wait to see what I pull from the jar next. But that will be for next time. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned as the sewing madness continues.